Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's event. Welcome today to 3GNY's webinar of Radical Remembrance, the Clash over Holocaust Memory in Poland. We are very excited to have you here today for a special presentation and discussion. My name is Lauren Engelman, and I'm a very proud 3G, a grandchild of a Holocaust survivor, my beautiful grandma Lily, who is 97 years young and my inspiration. Before we dive into today's program, we'd like to share a bit about 3GNY for those of you who may not be familiar. 3GNY is an educational nonprofit for grandchildren of Holocaust survivors and supporters. We Do, which is short for We Educate, is 3GNY's flagship educational initiative that empowers grandchildren of Holocaust survivors to learn and compellingly share their families' Holocaust experiences and stories with students and community groups. This work is needed now more than ever, and we are very proud to share that our story impacted over 12,000 students in 2023. Our work would not be possible without the support of our community. A gift to 3GNY of any amount would be very much appreciated. I will put a link in the chat with ways to donate. Thank you all who've already given, and to each of you for being here with us today. We'll be sending more information out about 3GNY, and We Do in a follow-up email after the event. I am very excited to introduce today's event, which features one of our very own dedicated 3GNY, Alex Rossen. As a graduate researcher, Alex has devoted considerable time to the question, how do we contemplate social memory? As a 3G who traces his heritage back to Poland, researching practices of memory in a country is a very personal line of research for Alex. His passion and expertise on the subject are informed by his family history and by extensive field experience in Poland. Alex is a Senior Warsaw Fellow at Humanity in Action. He is also the author of What Happens When Nationalism Seeps into Holocaust History, Look to Poland, published in the Forward in 2022, and Shatter the Cube, Challenging Historical Revisionism in Poland and the US, written for Humanity in Action in 2023. Today, Alex will discuss his upcoming project, Radical Remembrance, a Socio-Political Genealogy of the Legacy of the Holocaust in Poland, which was commissioned by and will present later this summer to the Council of European Studies as part of the 30th International Conference of Europeanists. Later, we will be joined by Professor Jody Russell Manning, lecturer and associate director of the Rowan University Center for the Study of Holocaust, Genocide, and Human Rights. Jody specializes in the research of Holocaust history and memory, Polish-Jewish relations, and the ramifications of genocide for contemporary society. He was the first American intern at the Auschwitz-Birkenau State Museum from 2005 to 2009. He is also the co-founder of the first International Graduate Student Conference for Holocaust and Genocide Studies at Clark University. Now, I'm happy to turn things over to Alex to get us started. Thank you.
Thank you, Lauren. Thank you, Jody. And thank you to the audience for tuning in. I'm pleased to be before you to discuss my incoming project, Radical Remembrance, a Socio-Political Genealogy over Holocaust memory in Poland. I would like to begin by tipping my hat to Lauren once more for posing the question, how do we contemplate social memory? Indeed, that is the question. Memory is all around us. It consists of all the material and immaterial representations that frame how we relate to the past. But most importantly, unlike history, memory is a social construct, which by that very same token is inherently subjective. Next slide, please, Jody. The important question is, how does memory function in society? Next slide, please. I'm sorry, one more slide. A Jewish historian named Michael Rothberg would tell us that this can happen in one of two ways. Memory can be competitive, or it can be multidirectional. In a related sense, next slide, please. Memory can either assume a critical or a nationalist angle. The dark past refers to a more critical and introspective interpretation of memory, whereas the pedagogy of pride emphasizes the past as a source of glory for the country. In Poland, clashes between these two pedagogies assume the form of a competitive memory framework, which means that different narratives of memory are engaged in a zero-sum battle for preeminence in a limited, mostly private framework. My research takes us through important considerations in how memory is negotiated in Poland, one of the most critical sites in the world for the preservation of both Holocaust history and Holocaust memory. Next slide, please. To do so, we have to start at the beginning. A key piece of the puzzle in my research is the increasing stratification of Poles and Jews, extending from the interwar period to the Holocaust to the post-war Reconstruction period. Many pogroms took place in these 3 decades, but more significantly, anti-Semitism was a big part of the political program of the Second Polish Republic from 1934 to 1939. Warsaw's trade minister Marian Kosakowski testified in a 1934 deposition that anti-Semitism was common, probably ineradicable, and used by all sides for election purposes. Anti-Semitism during this political period most commonly functioned as a rhetorical tool to unite quote-unquote true Poles against a quote-unquote internal foreigner, essentially stoking ethnic divisions to garner support. Next slide, please. One of the most extreme preservations of this rhetoric comes from an article from an unknown author, which was published in 1939 in the town of Kelce, mere months before the Nazi invasion. And the quote is as follows: "Every true Pole, if not openly, then in spirit, is an anti-Semite. For it is difficult to suppose that one who claims to be a patriot can have his own eyes closed to the enormity of the Jewish deluge. We are just waiting for an order, and we will quickly clean our home, our national homeland." Next slide, please. The study of ethnic violence in Poland is not just significant in and of itself. It is also important to note how it contributed to the stratification of Polish and Jewish narratives. This is important because this real-time narrative building would be the bedrock for the generational transmission of memory which would come next. In addition to being stoked by ethnic violence against Jews, this narrative separation was also agitated by a struggle for Polish and Jewish narratives of suffering to coexist. In another significant deposition, Poland's Foreign Minister Josef Beck subverted questions about widespread poverty in Warsaw's Jewish quarter because, he argued, millions of Poles were also in bad condition. This sentiment persevered across generations of Polish memory preservation efforts, deepened by the systemic oppression of the Polish people at the hands of the Soviet Union and the Nazi Party. Even today, this remains a prevailing sentiment in Poland, as in 2022, approximately half of respondents to a poll organized by CBOS reported that they believe that non-Jewish Poles were the biggest victims of the Holocaust. Next slide, please. The period between 1948 and 2000 was one of silence towards Polish violence against Jews. Incidents still happened, but they rarely became subjects of open discussion. A memorial to the victims of the Jedwabne pogrom of 1941 was built, but assigned all of the blame to Nazi officers. Coverage of the Kelce pogrom of 1948 appeared internationally in such publications as the New York Times, but the provisional Polish authorities announced the following day that it would not appear in the Polish press, citing that doing so would lead to similar incidents in other cities. This became a major status quo for quite a long time in Poland until the novel Neighbors came along. This landmark book by historian and sociologist Jan Gross set out to prove that the pogrom in Jedwabne was, contrary to popular belief at the time, committed by Polish gangs. Next slide, please. This revelation created massive ramifications for how Polish people related to the past and produced a wide range of reactions from shock to somber assent to further conspiracy theories. The majority of initial responses to Neighbors, however, elicited hope. It received broad support from Polish academia, and its findings would be confirmed by an investigation by the Polish Institute of National Remembrance in the following years. It was a sign that the old memory structure was collapsing and something new was coming together in its place. Next slide, please. However, the politics of memory in Poland took a radical turn in 2015 with the election of the right-wing Law and Justice Party. In it, right-wing populists used lawmaking, political communication and marketing, intimidation, and political violence to advance a more nationalist interpretation of Poland's Holocaust memory. Next slide, please. To understand the progression, I look mainly at the why and the how. Why is this radical turn taking place, and how is it being achieved? Two prevalent explanations exist which speak to the why. First, there are some very real and very valid frustrations in Poland that they are being unfairly stigmatized as a result of Poland's dark past. A Polish columnist and historian named Jerzy Jedlicki argued in 2000 that, quote, statements that do not steer clear of fabrication and slander can be read in American newspapers or heard in the Israeli Knesset. The second explanation is the extent to which rewriting the narrative of memory is an important component of the Law and Justice Party's electoral success. A pair of researchers in 2022 argued that, quote, the emotionally charged rhetoric of the Law and Justice Party builds on historically embedded narratives of pride and shame. Reinterpreting these emotions in the contemporary polarizing context therefore contributes to the electoral success of the populist right. Next slide, please. This leads us to the next question. I'm sorry, one slide back. How does the Law and Justice Party reinterpret these emotions in this manner? Two emerging strategies have stood out in my research: thematic framing and legislative reform. Thematic framing is a political strategy that involves using key words and phrases in political marketing and communication to influence public opinion on a certain domain or issue. The communication and marketing strategy of the Law and Justice Party in this sense is that they are here to defend Poland's good name against those who seek to tarnish it. Much of this had manifested in strategic positionings of feelings of pride and shame. The Law and Justice Party wanted to convince people that they were here to shield them from the pedagogy of shame allegedly coming from the left and the international community. Next slide, please. To enshrine this new narrative, the Polish government, under the leadership of the Law and Justice Party, passed an amendment in 2018 called colloquially the Holocaust Bill to the Act on the Institute of National Remembrance. This amendment proposed to criminalize any allegations of Polish complicity in the Holocaust or crimes against peace during the Holocaust, discouraging discussions of Polish involvement in such events as pogroms or collaboration. So at this point, having covering all this information, um, I'd like to turn it over to Jody, who I believe has some questions. Um, and then afterwards, I hope that we can move to Q&A to address some questions from people in the chat. Thank you for listening. I'll turn it over to Jody.
Thank you, Alex, for that really great overview and all of your research and everything you have done. And I want to unpack a lot of it, so I have multiple questions for you. I guess the first one that interests me would be just quickly before we get into sort of this history and what happened, your connection as a third generation and why this is important to you. If you could talk about that, specifically what you discussed in these incidents and events, because I also want to pick apart why possibly Kielce and Yevabne with neighbors really became these big symbols in the post period. But I'd like to hear about you and then also talk about that.
Yeah, that's a wonderful question that I've thought a lot about. Thank you, Jody. And before I get into that, I want to pay a very special tribute to my grandmother and great aunt who are in the audience in attendance today. I love you both very much.
Can I quickly say hi? I just want to say hi because I know
yes,
them.
of course.
So,
But I've always been profoundly moved by the fact that their story in particular represents both sides of the coin, heroism and villainy. Um, I would also like to call attention and pay tribute to the fact that none of my family would be here without the risks and personal sacrifices of a Polish hero named Helena Skrzewska, who is honored among the righteous of the nations. But they were also raised in a village very close to Lvov, now known as Lviv, where both Polish and Ukrainian extremists committed pogroms at various points from 1918 to 1945. Knowing that both sides of the coin exist in my family's history have given me a deep sense of duty to make sure that both sides are equally represented and assigned equal importance in the study of Holocaust history and also conversations about memory of the Holocaust in Poland.
okay. And can you talk quickly about Kielce and Yevabne and why you feel those are really sort of the ones we really remember of what happened in Poland from the perspective of the Jewish communities from Poland?
Yeah, that's a very good question that I wish I had a better answer for, but it seems quite um oddly fortuitous that this the events of the last few decades played out the way they did. Um, the research that Jan Gross did to uncover the crimes of Jedwabne could have been um, directed at any number of dozens of pogroms that may have been similarly suppressed in the annals of Polish memory. But the fact that this kind of unraveling of the old memory narrative started with Jedwabne was or is rather pertinent to me because it pays tribute to the work of many significant Polish Jewish figures of the time, like Shmuel Wasserstein, who tried to testify in court and in Polish Jewish media to get this story out there, but it had never quite resurfaced in the mainstream annals of Polish discussion until Jan Gross's book came out in 2000. So this book, in addition to, being an important contribution to history, sociology, and memory, brings justice to people like Shmuel Wasserstein as well.
Yeah. Um, I want to ask a question that we have not actually discussed before, which is really interesting. And I want to know, I want you to comment a little bit on local populations, right? You in your presentation, you talked about competitive memories, which are very important. Obviously, clearly in Poland, there are many competitive memories here. And memory is inherently political, as you've discussed, right? And that's really important to talk about. And also, I think an emphasis on Cold War politics, right? Communism really mattered here in how this memory was shaped and how memory was actually like given from the top down. And you really covered that well, I think, in explaining this top-down approach to memory and how much control the government had over what was said or what was done. Not only that, but physical remnants, right? I sit here, Alex knows, but I should share with the audience. I'm sitting in the city of Oświęcim, which is the city where Auschwitz, right, the memorial is. And there, everywhere I look, there are traces, remnants, physicals, physical spaces left from the Jewish community when there are no Jews here in the city of Oświęcim today. And the one thing that I'm always reminded of, and something that I thought about while you were talking, was this idea that even though the government was sort of Polonizing the Holocaust, right? Focusing on non-Jews, and especially because of communism, right? But locals remember, right? Locals knew where their Jewish neighbors lived, where their shops were, where the synagogue was, right? Those who had not, those who would even if they had been destroyed, right? Here in Oświęcim, there's one surviving synagogue, and the great synagogue was destroyed, right? And I guess my point is, can you speak a little bit to how locals and how the individual, not just governments, that you in your research, how has been the reaction there? And if you could give a little bit, because I'm more interested always in the bottom up, right? And how memory is shaped from those. Because I also know there's a lot of good work happening with grassroots movements in remembering this past, especially in face of the Law and Justice Party. I'll stop talking. I want to hear what your comments are.
Yeah, I've definitely thought a lot about that, and I definitely aim to do more research in bottom-up grassroots movements the next time I'm in Poland. But, for example, the work of the Jan Karski Society stands out quite a bit. But, I know you also mentioned briefly the disappearance of Poland's Jewish community as a driving factor, which I find very profound, um, very sad, and very pertinent because this is a struggle that's going to affect and continues to affect Polish Jewish survivors and their descendants. That I suppose it's just that um, we have to figure out how to deal with reinserting ourselves into this narrative that had, in a sense, included Jewish stories without necessarily included Jewish voices. This is another critical aspect of the old memory narrative that over the last 23 years, due to important voices like Jan Gross, has come tumbling down. But this reshaping of the new narrative is going to come with a lot of challenges. Um, for example, it receives a lot of backlash, like you mentioned, from the Law and Justice Party. Jaroslaw Kaczynski argued in a speech in 2012 that the history of the Holocaust in Poland should be a source of pride and not shame. But the reality and the source of, this counter movement we see from organizations like the Jan Karski Society is that it should really be both. It should be a more complete narrative that entails pride and shame. And over the decades, this idea has, in a sense, risen and fallen, like you said, Jody, due to political movements and radical political changes in Poland from then until now. The journalist Adam Michnik, founder of Poland's biggest newspaper, once famously said that Neighbors was only possible once the boot of the Soviet Union was lifted from the neck of Poland. So in a sense, narratives like Jan Gross's and narratives like the more critical ones, scholars and organizations like the Jan Karski Society are trying to put forth now would only be possible in a egalitarian democratic society. Um, and with the kind of radical populist turn that took place under the Law and Justice Party, those conditions kind of came under threat. And many Polish voices spoke to how this was threatening free speech and academic conversation. The education minister under the previous administration, for example, argued that education reforms instituted under the Law and Justice Party reminded her of the education system she grew up under during the Soviet Union. So in this sense, what happened under the Law and Justice Party from 2015 to 2022 was very troubling, but the new election of the Civic Coalition, the center-left party, in that sense, represents a new paradigm shift that may hopefully lead to a restoration of more earnest, multi-directional conversation between these two narratives.
Yeah, I agree with you. And I think something important you were speaking of is silence is the hardest, I guess, the biggest blow to memory, right? And discourse, although difficult, right, is the most important to bring about challenging old ideas or paradigms or things that you have been taught, right? And this we can see with Jan Gross's Neighbors, right? And this backlash of, yes, that happened, but. And I think that those discussions are extremely difficult, but so important to changing the way the history is written. And yes, that's true. Until communism was gone, nothing could be done. The other thing, though, I guess, what's sort of interesting and important here is that this isn't, even though we are talking about Poland, right? This isn't just happening in Poland. We've seen this in other countries recently as well, right? I, of course, think of Hungary, right? And firing of people from different museums and changing narratives and things like this. Do you feel now, and it's always, I would always say, don't ask a historian to ever predict the future, but thank goodness, you are not a historian here, international relations. So what do you think is going to happen now, right? How do you see this shift, this recent shift? Do you see that as a positive? Do you see things changing? What's your feelings here?
Yeah, so my reaction so far to the behavior of the Civic Coalition's new majority in the Polish Sejm has been one of cautious optimism, and I've also noted meager progress, but you know, my most important finding was that the thematic framing of this memory narrative has not changed substantially from the Law and Justice Party to the Civic Coalition, because, for instance, the characteristics that define this framing narrative is one that kind of emphasizes stories of Polish heroism and doesn't really give space to directly addressing instances of Polish violence against Jews. That's still a high priority in the marketing and communication strategy of the Civic Coalition based on the data that is currently available. And I addressed and researched that question by looking at tweets they put out and statements government representatives have released to honor such memorial days as International Holocaust Remembrance Day. And what I found is that those statements still emphasize stories of Polish heroism almost exclusively. But the good news is that stringent efforts to use more down and dirty tactics like intimidation and threats and political violence are not any longer part of the agenda of the civic coalition. You know, instances like the Holocaust bill would no longer receive the support they did under the Law and Justice Party. But again, the bad news is that being relegated to the fringe of Polish politics has not really stopped the Law and Justice Party or parties further from the right in engaging with this behavior. Um, Many people may already be aware of a headline that appeared in Polish news some months ago where a far-right minister named Gregor Braun upstaged a historian named Jan Grabowski, who came to Warsaw to give a talk about a more critical historiographical narrative of Poland's Holocaust history. And when Gregor Braun upstaged him, he claimed, of course, that he was speaking in defense of Poland's good name. So, in that sense, I think that this election will not stop um, right-wing populist actors in Poland from engaging in these movements, but it will hinder their ability to implement their vision legislatively, which is a good thing.
Yeah, and I mean, sadly, we have seen, well, good and bad. We've seen these incidences before, but relatively they're, not widespread, which is, the other side of the coin.
Yeah.
Uh, yeah. I also, I wonder, we have to be honest about this. Change is not going to happen overnight, right? These changes, in good or bad, or dealing with this memory, right, and this competitive understanding of the past, right? And so, do you feel, right? It's going to take some time. It's going to come. Do you think it's mainly going to come from the top down, or do you think bottom up, or do you feel like there's going to be some sort of meeting in the middle? Because a lot of damage can be done. But I've also seen a lot of backlash to this, right? There have been a lot of protests. There have been a lot of discussions about this history, and especially there's lots of, as we already talked about, local initiatives on keeping memory of Jewish spaces and Jewish communities alive in Poland, especially after '89, but even more recently.
Yeah, I certainly hope to see these changes take root from the down, the bottom up, because that is the most critical avenue for change in any egalitarian democratic society. But the Law and Justice Party has proved that there are ways to kind of get involved in these communications and marketing strategies that I believe I talked about a little bit to kind of slyly influence the outcomes of public opinion, which has to do with how these issues are framed in the media and how they're framed by direct political actors. And the Law and Justice Party has been very notorious for relying on these strategies in a number of ways that even go beyond Holocaust memory. Um, in a referendum that the Law and Justice Party scheduled immediately before the election, they posed an immigration question where the framing they used to, I believe, influence the outcome was, do you approve of the EU forcing us to accept more illegal immigrants? So obviously, it doesn't take much to imagine that framing a very real and very important issue of migration in such a way with those words is going to unfairly influence the outcome. This is a subject of research that I've looked at a lot in international affairs more generally, how the use of certain keywords can shape how citizens engage with issues, which then leaves lasting and damaging remarks on public discourse. For example, a survey by researchers just last year in America studied this by putting out a poll to address an issue in America using different sets of keywords to see if that would influence survey respondents' answer to the question. For example, one question was, do you support welfare? And another question was framed as, do you support providing assistance to the poor? The amount of respondents that answered yes to welfare was 14%, but the amount of respondents that answered yes to providing support for the poor was over 50%. So this is just an example how the use of certain keywords has a profound effect on how we, as everyday citizens, engage in politics.
Yeah, most definitely, right? And I think that's very important. And I wonder, going back to this change, right? Whether it's Poland's going to go more inclusive or more exclusive, right? Even with the questions of immigration, Holocaust memory, right? Polish suffering, martyrdom, things like this. There's also generational differences, which are very key, and that's something to think about. That's really important. And so I guess there's a work by Susan Nyman, very important. I don't know if you're aware of it, right? About how we can learn from the German past, right? And her work's mainly about how the U.S., in the South, right? But also the government can learn from what Germany did in the post-war period to deal with Holocaust memory, right? And so I wonder two things from you, and I guess I'll wait on the third question because I don't want to throw too much at you, but generations, how does that matter, and where do you see that? Because I feel that that's sort of something important. And then also, can we learn from other, or could Poland learn from other countries in how to deal with these issues?
Yeah, I definitely think this generational angle is very important. I've done previous research on the passage of intergenerational trauma as a result of state violence. And one of the main reasons that Polish memory is so complicated is that Polish people who inherit this history have to balance both the oppression of Jews during the Holocaust and their own oppression at the hands of primarily the Soviet Union, but also the Nazi regime. And, I like to think of it in the sense that everybody has their little backpack that they carry around with them, which is very heavy. And if they feel that they are not legitimate in expressing these traumas, that creates very uncomfortable conversations. So everybody has to have the space where their traumas are treated as valid. And that creates one of the arenas where Polish memory is very complicated because a prevailing sentiment that does exist in Poland is that the stereotype that's coming to the fore as a result of these revelations, in many cases, is that Poland is an anti-Semitic place, and that is not at all, generally speaking, true. And it also contributes to this sense of tension between different mnemonic narratives, which are both valid. So we have to figure out a way to reconcile it and make this struggle between narratives not appear to be a competition, but just a conversation.
That was really profound, right? Not competition, but conversation. Good quote, Alex, from you to take away. I want to open this up to questions, right, from those who are watching. But I have one last sort of quick question, because I think it's something that I had not really dealt with in my own work or thought about. And I need to sort of, get in tune with what's going on. How does social media, right, and this access to vast information play in what you're researching? Because it can really make a difference. And this is also ties into generation, right? Like, I'm not always a big social media person, and those my age are not, but the younger generation definitely is. This is where they're getting their news. This is where they're getting their information. And I wonder how you see social media playing out in Poland with this history, with this discourse, and how or is it important?
Yeah, I think that social media in this sense is both a a symptom and a cause of this kind of hyperpolarization um, in Poland, which in many ways mirrors a hyperpolarization in America. Discourse online about this is, in addition to being stratified historically across non-Jewish and Jewish Polish narratives, is also now becoming stratified between the left and the right. I experienced this firsthand in 2022 when my article in the Forward was released. Of course, it was posted by the Forward on Twitter, and I experienced some very mean-spirited comments myself from, you know, what may or may not be real accounts. But this is important because many people who engage in these critical discussions about Polish history get dragged into this very tense conversation that's really just about left-right polarization.
Yeah, I I agree. I want to go ahead and open it up to questions. So for those of you, right, who are watching, you can put questions in the chat. I have a few already, so that's great. And then we can also, if you want, you could use your raise the hand option at the bottom of your screen, or just indicate and say you have a question. So I want to start with the first question. Let's see. This is a great observation, the importance of validation of people's respective traumas. With that said, how do politics play into everyone's need to validating the now traumas relative to the past, which may seek to minimize?
Um, let's see the question.
Oh yeah, you should have it in the chat. Oh, and I guess that I also have another question coming up as well.
Uh, yeah, so that's a really important question because I think we find based on, both Poland and the US that politics rarely functions to provide an effective avenue to fulfill that need. Um, especially in the case of the Law and Justice Party, because that clash really fed into their electoral success. So it was in their direct interest to present other perspectives as a direct threat to their own perspective, so that that political party could position itself as a sort of shield to protect its voters from having to engage in those conversations. But, you know, real progress towards that in the sense can't really come from the government, in my opinion. And I don't think it really behooves the government to try as much as to give the space for non-state actors to help people meet that need themselves. And it can come from academic institutions in Poland. It can also come from, a litany of wonderful nonprofits, including the Jan Karski Society. But I believe that it must be treated as an outside of state project.
Hmm. Yeah, I think we could discuss this for a very long time, right? Of this approach.
Mhm.
I guess I wanted to. I think this is a really good question in the question and answer about your potential question of academic objectivity for you and your personal background.
Mhm.
And you know, uh, they're not questioning your objectivity, but they want to. They personally stay away from Holocaust topics as a graduate student. and due to their family history, they're asking, how does this work for you? How does this bring up your family history in this idea of being objective, right? And I feel like, yeah, I won't answer for myself, but it speaks more importantly to you being third generation.
Yeah, and that's an important point because, as a scholar who is directly connected to this through this generational history, I do by definition have a bias, which is not, I don't treat that as a disqualification as much as a challenge that I need to do extra work to make sure that I can overcome it. Um, and I've taken that to heart during my past experience as a journalist that has taught me that there is no such thing as being free from bias, but there is such a thing as learning how to effectively manage your biases. In this sense, like I said again, I don't see that as a limitation as much as an extra hurdle. And I've taken a lot of time and care to manage this, and I think the way to overcome it that I've learned is that I have to, spend equal amounts of time researching narratives of trauma between Jews and non-Jews in Poland. That was a big driving force in my research in the Polish state archives, where I learned a lot about what Polish prisoners of war and civilian dissidents experienced in Soviet labor camps, like Vorkuta, for example. And what I found was really profound in a lot of ways. And the most, um, I think, surprising and, I believe inspiring testimonies that I encountered from that was, whereas most of my research from within Poland spoke to this inherent division between Jewish and non-Jewish Poles based on a litany of factors, that tension disappeared between Jewish and non-Jewish prisoners of war in places like Vorkuta. One testimony I encountered was that Jews and non-Jews in those camps stood more often than not in solidarity with one another. And this is important to consider because, you know, social conditions in this sense shape the way we interact with one another. And the most important thing we can do in the face of that is figure out how to navigate those conditions in a way that don't set us in tension with our neighbors, but rather in trust, earnest communication, and respect.
Yeah, I agree. And I think, I mean, going back to academic objectivity, right? We have to realize we're not, right? In many ways,
Yeah.
everything shapes what we write, think, and who we are, and our experiences, especially, right? And I think it's really something, as you said, that as long as we recognize it and we try to, we make sure that we're involving that as well, right? Because no one is not unbiased, right? And so I think that that's really, really important. And also that this speaks, again, we are talking about Polish memory and what has happened in Poland specifically, but being a Holocaust and genocide scholar, right? A lot of these memory negotiations, this hard history, politics, right? This happens in many, many other places as well. And it's something that we can understand. We have our objectivity, but I think the bigger research and the bigger answers that we are uncovering are more important than, right? And to what we're doing, right?
Mm-hmm.
I hope you would agree with that.
Certainly, yes.
Yes, and the person who asked the question said that was an awesome answer. So,
thank you. I very much appreciate that question. Thank you for asking it.
I have a question from a Todd. The question is there a Jewish presence? I believe they're saying in the Jewish Historical Institute, for example, in the examination of the occupation years.
So I would like to ask for clarification that this refers to the occupation of either the Soviet Union after the war, or does it refer to the occupation of the Nazi regime during the war?
Right. That hopefully Todd will give us some clarity, right? And I know, right? I guess this is a good time, right, to say that you have also been to the Jewish Historical Institute. They've done some really amazing work, and so and even recently, they've really been publishing and working on a lot of this history and memory. So maybe we will get a clarification. Nazi occupation, Todd said.
Yes. So yeah, I'm, so grateful to the work that the Jewish Historical Institute did during these years. I wholeheartedly believe that, had they never taken the initiative to record and write down and preserve the testimony of Shmuel Wasserstein at the Wurmser trials in 1941, we would know nothing now about what really happened at the Yad pogrom. It was the principal piece of evidence that Jan Gross used to prove that this crime was in fact committed by Polish gangs, and furthermore done under the direction of the Polish mayor. So it speaks volumes that they've gone to such lengths to provide this service for us. And for that work, we should all be very much indebted to them, because they did so much to create the need for these more critical conversations to happen. And, in that sense, I think, it opened up opportunities for people not necessarily to blame each other, but to say, okay, this is what happened, and this needs, in that sense, to, become the new basis on which we engage both with each other now and with our history, because critical history, you know, is an extremely important angle, not because it's supposed to evoke feelings of shame, but because it's supposed to evoke a prerogative to facilitate positive change now based on what we know of the past. That's why we study the Holocaust.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And I think that the Jewish Historical Institute in particular does a very good job here, right? And speaking of, but I also wonder about institutions. And please, if there are any final questions, we do have a few minutes before the end here. Please put them in the question and answer or raise your hand. We are very happy to discuss this. I wonder, because one of the interesting things that happens, speaking of Jewish presence in these institutions, for example, Alex and I have both been to the Schindler Factory in Krakow, and most visitors think they're going to see Schindler's List and everything about Schindler, but when you go and what happened to the residents there in Krakow, right? And so, did you feel that there was the Jewish experience in that museum, if you remember, or do you feel that that's a acceptable way to sort of get the memory out, right?
Yeah, I can't speak much to my memory of that specific visit, but I have a lot to say more broadly with regard to my many visits in Poland, of how I engaged with and related to Polish Jewish memory there, because the plummeting population of Jews in Poland from 1945 until now created a lot of problems for how Jewish memory would be preserved. Many institutions and organizations thankfully rose up to do their best to kind of meet that. But, Jewish legacies and narratives being preserved by non-Jews also created some narrative problems. If you go now to Krakow, and I say this because this is what happened in my experience touring the Jewish quarter, the majority of tours now are conducted by non-Jews who I find for the most part do a good job, but I also have come to the opinion that including Jewish narratives in these initiatives will be of extreme importance going forward to try and supply this kind of sense of authenticity to that Jewish history.
Just going up that, I mean, as you know, the biggest debate right now, at least locally with academics and with those who have organizations are about this, right? Virtual Jewishness, right? Of even the Kashmir's district, most of the stores and restaurants are not owned by Jews. They're owned by Poles, Christian Poles, but they're giving this sort of virtual Jewish experience, right? And there's this big debate of, how acceptable is that? And the argument is if they weren't doing it, then there wouldn't be these places, right, of memory. I can speak also for the Auschwitz Jewish Center right here in Schwänchen, right? It is a foundation and it is mainly local Poles who are working there, and they do very, very important work, not even so much for visitors, but they're doing it for the local population actually, to get this history and to let those who live in the city know that pre-war, Oświęcim was a 60% Jewish city, right? Which is sort of lost in the memory because there are no Jews here today. And so it's a really difficult discussion, and I still am, sort of back and forth about a lot of these things. But
yeah, I feel the same way.
Yeah, so I don't know if you want to say a comment any more on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm noticing that we're almost out of time, but if I may add one more point to that is that, one other question that, different cities in Poland now have to navigate after the absence of their Jewish communities is what initiatives of preservation are appropriate and what are not. I also encountered this issue quite a lot in Krakow. And the example I always refer to is that there's a former synagogue in the heart of Krakow's Jewish quarter. It is preserved, but it is now preserved as a bar and kind of like a social hangout. So the dilemma with that is, of course, and I won't directly weigh in on this, is that an appropriate preservation of this very important piece of Jewish history?
Yeah. Unfortunately, we have to wrap up, but I want to add to that and what you're saying, and we will have a good discussion about this. And if anybody ever has questions or want to talk about it, of course, we are available. You can always email us. But the other thing I want to say is there's a lot of history from 1945 to 2024 that needs to be considered in why this is a bar, right? And so it's not just as simple as, that it is what it is now. You can't discount all of that history and everything that's played out from then.
Agreed,
so,
yeah.
Alex, I just want to thank you so very much for this, and I'm going to turn it over to you to end things and to wrap things up.
Oh, yeah, and thank you right back, Jody. This was really a singular pleasure, to speak with you, the audience. I also wanted to point out the extent to which this event was organized and would not be possible without the help of 3GNY's amazing staff and volunteers. I'd like to thank the entire event and social media team, in particular Dave Rekas, David Wax, and Elizabeth Kamens, for all their amazing contributions from behind the curtain. I would also like to extend my sincere gratitude to Lauren Engelman for introducing this program and to Jody for moderating this conversation. Thank you all so much.
Thank you, Alex.